Brooklyn Navy Yard, New York, March 1942. The conference room smelled of cigar smoke and salt water. 5 naval officers sat around a mahogany table, their uniforms pressed sharp, their faces hardened by months of catastrophic losses in the Atlantic. Outside the window, the skeletal frames of destroyers rose against a grey sky, half-finished monuments to America's desperate race against time. Joseph Binks stood at the head of the table, holding what looked like a metal pistol, with a jar attached to its body. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He'd driven through the night from Chicago, carrying his prototype in a wooden crate padded with old newspapers. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice hoarse, "this device can reduce ship painting time by 70%. Admiral Harrington didn't look up from his papers. "We're fighting a war, Mr. Binks, not redecorating apartments." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Joseph felt heat rise to his face, but he pressed on. "With respect, Admiral, every destroyer we build takes approximately 2,000 man-hours just for painting. My spray gun can—" "Spray gun?" Captain Morrison leaned forward, squinting at the device. "That's a toy, a goddamn toy." "It's precision engineering, sir. Compressed air atomizes the paint into a fine mist, applying an even coat in a fraction of the time. I've tested it on—" "We have brushes," Harrington interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, dismissive. "Brushes that have built every naval vessel for 200 years. Brushes that don't malfunction, don't clog, don't waste paint all over the deck." Joseph's throat tightened. He'd anticipated resistance, but not contempt. "Sir, the Germans are sinking our merchant ships faster than we can replace them. Liberty ships are being rushed through production, but the painting process creates bottlenecks. If we could save even 500 hours per vessel—" If, Morrison stood, buttoning his jacket. "Mr. Binks, we don't have time for experiments. We need solutions that work now, not gadgets that might work someday." "But it does work." Joseph's voice cracked with desperation. He grabbed the paint jar, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Let me demonstrate." "Put that down." Harrington's command was quiet, absolute. "We're not turning this office into a carnival." The silence that followed felt like drowning. Joseph lowered the spray gun slowly, carefully, as if it were made of glass and hope in equal measure. Lieutenant Commander Webb, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Admiral, if I may, the production reports from last month show we're running 6 weeks behind schedule on destroyer escorts alone. Perhaps we should at least—" "Webb!" Harrington's voice could have frozen the Atlantic. "Are you questioning 2 centuries of naval tradition?" "No, sir. I'm questioning whether we can afford to ignore any potential advantage when U-boats are sending 100,000 tons to the bottom every week." The room went deadly quiet. Joseph watched Webb's career hang in the balance, this young officer risking everything for a stranger's invention. Harrington stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Gentlemen, we are the United States Navy. We do not panic. We do not abandon proven methods for unproven gadgets. We do not—" He turned his gaze to Joseph, and it was like being examined by something ancient and immovable. "Allow basement inventors to tell us how to build warships." "Thank you for your time, Mr. Binks," Harrington continued, his tone making it clear the meeting was over. "The Navy will continue with proven methods. Good day." Joseph gathered his prototype with shaking hands. Webb gave him an apologetic look, but said nothing more. The other officers were already discussing next month's production schedules, as if Joseph had never existed. Outside, the March wind cut through Joseph's thin coat. He stood on the dock, watching welders send showers of sparks across the hull of a half-built cruiser. 300 yards away, he could see them, dozens of workers on scaffolding, their arms moving in the ancient rhythm of brush against steel. Up, down, dip, paint, up, down. So slow, so incredibly, impossibly slow. Joseph had done the mathematics 100 times. Each brushstroke covered maybe 6 square inches. Each dip in the paint bucket took 3 seconds. Each section required 2 coats, sometimes 3. Multiply that across a destroyer's 30,000 square feet of surface area, and you got numbers that made his stomach turn. 2,000 hours per ship just for painting. And America needed to build hundreds of ships, thousands maybe, before this war was done. He thought about his workshop back in Chicago, the late nights experimenting with air pressure and nozzle designs. His wife Margaret had stopped asking when he'd come to bed. His children had learned to eat dinner without him, all for a device that admirals called ridiculous. A young man in oil-stained coveralls approached, carrying a clipboard thick with production sheets. "Rough meeting?" Joseph looked at him, mid-20s, lean, with intelligent eyes that seemed too alert for someone working night shifts in a shipyard. "They called it ridiculous," Joseph said quietly. "A toy." The young man glanced at the wooden crate. "What is it?" "Something that could save millions of hours, maybe save lives if ships could get to sea faster." Joseph picked up his crate, shoulders sagging. "But what do I know? I'm just a basement inventor from Chicago." "Wait." The young man's voice had an edge of urgency. "You said millions of hours?" Joseph turned back. "Minimum. Probably closer to 50 million across the entire war effort if you calculate painting time for every vessel under construction. Liberty ships, destroyer escorts, cruisers, battleships, support vessels, every single one needs to be painted. And we're doing it the same way we did in 1812. The young man stared at the crate, then at the scaffolding where painters worked with maddening slowness. His jaw tightened. "I'm Daniel Chen," he said, extending his hand, "assistant production engineer, and I think the Navy just made the biggest mistake of this war." Joseph shook his hand, feeling the calluses of someone who worked with tools, not just paperwork. Joseph Binks, inventor of ridiculous toys, apparently. "Can I see it?" They moved to a quieter section of the dock, away from the welding crews and foremen. Joseph opened the crate with the careful movements of a man handling something sacred. The spray gun gleamed dully in the weak sunlight, aluminum body, brass fittings, a glass jar that could hold a pint of paint. "It's based on a design I developed for painting cars," Joseph explained, "but I modified it for marine paint, which is thicker, more viscous. The air compressor creates pressure, 40 to 60 pounds per square inch, that forces paint through this nozzle here. The air stream breaks the paint into microscopic droplets, creating a fine mist that covers surfaces evenly." Daniel's eyes moved over the device with the intensity of someone reading a technical manual. "What's the coverage rate?" "In my tests, about 80 square feet per minute with proper technique. Compare that to brush painting, which averages maybe 12 square feet per hour per man." Daniel's hand froze on his clipboard. That's impossible." "That's mathematics." Joseph's voice was bitter, but apparently mathematics don't matter when tradition is at stake. "Show me." Daniel looked around, checking for nearby supervisors. "There's a storage shed over by Dock 7. No one uses it this time of day. If you can demonstrate even half of what you are claiming, I can demonstrate exactly what I'm claiming." Joseph's exhaustion was replaced by a spark of defiance. "The device works. It's always worked. The only thing that doesn't work is trying to convince men who've already made up their minds." They walked quickly through the shipyard, past mountains of steel plate and rivers of welding cable. The storage shed was exactly as Daniel described, abandoned, forgotten, its walls still showing the grey primer from whenever it was last maintained. Daniel found a brush and a can of Navy specification paint. "Standard method first. Time me." He dipped the brush and began painting a marked section of wall. His strokes were practiced, efficient. This wasn't his first time with a brush, but even with skill, the coverage was painfully slow. 5 minutes passed. The section was half covered, the paint showing visible brushstrokes. 10 minutes total, Daniel said, stepping back. And this would need a second coat once it dried. Now show me what that toy can do. Joseph connected a small portable compressor he'd brought, filled the jar with paint, and tested the pressure. The familiar hiss of compressed air was like a greeting from an old friend. "Watch the technique," he said. "Distance and angle matter. Too close and you get runs. Too far and the paint dries before it hits the surface." He pulled the trigger. The transformation was immediate. Paint flowed like liquid silk, covering the wall in smooth, even strokes. Joseph moved with practiced efficiency, each pass overlapping the last by exactly 50%. The sound was a soft hiss, almost meditative. 90 seconds later, he stepped back. The wall section was completely covered, smooth as glass, no brushstrokes visible. Daniel touched the painted surface, then looked at his watch, then back at the wall. His face had gone pale. 90 seconds, he whispered. "You just did in 90 seconds what took me 10 minutes. And the coverage is better, objectively, measurably better. Now you understand why I drove through the night to show them." Joseph disconnected the compressor, his movements heavy with defeat. "And now you understand why it doesn't matter. They've made their decision." "No!" Daniel's voice was hard, certain. "They've made a mistake, and mistakes can be corrected." Brooklyn Navy Yard, April 1942, 2:47 a.m. The construction dock was supposed to be empty. Daniel had checked the night shift schedules 3 times, memorized the patrol routes of the security guards, and chosen a fog-thick Tuesday when visibility was nearly 0. Now he stood beside Joseph Binks in the shadow of a half-painted destroyer escort, his heart hammering against his ribs. If they were caught, his career was over. If they weren't caught, his career might still be over. But at least he'd know the truth. "You're sure about this?" Joseph whispered, assembling the spray gun with practiced movements. His hands no longer trembled. In the month since his rejection, something had hardened in him, a quiet fury that burned steady as a welding torch. "I'm not sure about anything," Daniel admitted, "except that we're losing this war in the Atlantic, and every day matters." The destroyer's hull loomed above them, a test section marked with chalk lines. Standard Navy procedure called for 2 coats of primer, 2 coats of paint, applied by brush over the course of 16 hours. Daniel had calculated it himself. 4 men, 4 hours each, per section this size. Joseph connected the air compressor, a small unit Daniel had borrowed from the welding station. The hose hissed softly as pressure built. "The key is distance and angle," Joseph explained, his voice taking on the careful tone of a craftsman teaching his trade. 6 to 8 inches from the surface, 45-degree strokes, overlapping each pass by half. The paint particles need to atomize completely before contact, otherwise you get runs. The air pressure has to be consistent. Any fluctuation, and the spray pattern becomes uneven. Daniel nodded, recording everything in his notebook. He was building a case, one technical detail at a time. If they were going to challenge the Navy's decision, they needed documentation that was irrefutable. "What about paint waste?" Daniel asked. Morrison mentioned waste as a concern. "Overspray is minimal with proper technique," Joseph replied, adjusting the nozzle. "Maybe 5% compared to the paint that gets absorbed into brush bristles or drips during traditional application. And the time saved more than compensates for any material loss. A gallon of paint costs $3. An hour of skilled labor costs twice that." "Chen, is that you down there?" Both men froze. A flashlight beam cut through the fog, sweeping across the dock. Daniel's mind raced. Security guard, probably old Miller from the front gate, which meant he'd seen Daniel's face when he signed in for equipment inventory, which meant, "Equipment check, sir," Daniel called out, trying to keep his voice casual. "Found some irregularities in the pressure gauge readings on the welding compressors." The flashlight beam held steady for 3 heartbeats. 4, 5. At 300 hours, Can't shut down production during the day, sir. You know how Admiral Brennan gets when we fall behind schedule. Better to check equipment during the night shift than have a compressor fail during peak hours. Another pause. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Joseph's tension beside him, like a physical presence. "Carry on," Miller's voice came back, "but file a proper report in the morning. And stay warm. This fog's thick enough to drown in." The flashlight retreated. Daniel exhaled slowly, his legs suddenly weak. "We have maybe 20 minutes, he whispered. "Can you do it?" Joseph's answer was the soft hiss of the spray gun coming to life. What happened next would stay with Daniel Chen for the rest of his life. The paint didn't brush on, it floated on, a perfect mist that settled like silk across the steel. Joseph's movements were fluid, economical, each stroke covering an area that would have taken a brush painter 10 minutes. The primer coat went down first, a rust-inhibiting foundation that dried almost immediately in the salt air. Then the top coat, navy grey, the colour of storms and ocean depths. Joseph worked with the concentration of a surgeon, his entire body in tune with the rhythm of the spray. Daniel timed everything, his stopwatch clicking off the minutes with mechanical precision. 12 minutes for the primer, 14 for the top coat, including time to refill the paint jar. 26 minutes total. Daniel ran his hand across the surface, feeling for runs or thin spots. Nothing, just flawless coverage, already drying in the salt air. He pulled out a paint thickness gauge, a device that measured coating depth to ensure Navy specifications were met. Every measurement was perfect, not just adequate, perfect. "My God," he breathed. "It actually works." Of course it works. Joseph was already disconnecting the equipment, his face unreadable in the darkness. "I tried to tell them. We need to document this. Photographs, time logs, paint thickness measurements, material costs. Documentation won't matter." Joseph's voice was bitter. "You heard them. They don't want innovation, they want tradition. Then we go over their heads." Daniel grabbed Joseph's arm, his grip tight with urgency. "The Bureau of Ships in Washington, the War Production Board. Hell, we go to the White House if we have to. Someone up there has to care about efficiency. And if they don't..." Daniel looked up at the destroyer, its painted section gleaming dully in the fog. Somewhere in the Atlantic, U-boats were hunting. Merchant ships were burning. Sailors were drowning in oil-slicked water, waiting for rescue vessels that couldn't be built fast enough because the Navy was too proud to accept that a Chicago inventor might know something they didn't. "Then we find someone who does," Daniel said, "because you're right, this isn't about tradition anymore. It's about whether we win or lose this war." A ship's horn sounded in the distance, low and mournful. The fog pressed closer, wrapping around them like cold fingers. And in a shadowed corner of Brooklyn Navy Yard, two men stood beside a revolutionary device that the United States Navy had declared ridiculous. Above them, visible through breaks in the fog, the stars were fading into dawn. In 6 hours, the day shift would arrive. In 6 hours, someone would see the test section and ask questions. In 6 hours, everything would change, or nothing would. Daniel Chen pulled out a notebook and began writing furiously, documenting every detail. Paint type, Navy Standard Gray, specification N47. Pressure settings, 55 psi. Application time, 26 minutes for complete two-coat coverage. Coverage area, 140 square feet. Paint consumption, 1.2 gallons. Labor, 1 man. Quality rating, exceeds Navy specifications for coating thickness and uniformity. He wrote like a man trying to save the world with mathematics, because in a way he was. Joseph Binks watched him, something like hope kindling behind his exhausted eyes. This young engineer believed, against all logic, against all evidence that the Navy would never change its mind, Daniel Chen believed that truth could win. "You really think we can convince them?" Joseph asked quietly. Daniel didn't look up from his notes. "We have to, because if we don't, history will remember this moment as the day America chose pride over victory." The fog swallowed their words. The compressor cooled with soft ticking sounds. And on the hull of a destroyer that would launch in 3 months to hunt submarines in the North Atlantic, a perfectly painted section dried in the darkness, silent testimony to the cost of dismissing genius as ridiculous. Somewhere in Washington, admirals were sleeping soundly in their Georgetown townhouses. Somewhere in the Atlantic, U-boat commanders were studying convoy routes by candlelight. And somewhere in the space between innovation and tradition, between vision and blindness, the Second World War was being won or lost by the width of a brushstroke and the pride of men who couldn't admit they were wrong. The paint gun sat in its wooden crate, waiting. The numbers didn't lie. 50 million man-hours hung in the balance. 50 million hours that could build more ships, train more sailors, win more battles. 50 million hours being wasted because 5 officers in a conference room had laughed at a device they didn't understand. Daniel finished his notes and looked at Joseph. We'll need another demonstration for Washington, something they can't ignore. Something so dramatic that even the most stubborn admiral can't deny the evidence. They ignored it once. Then we'll make it impossible to ignore twice. Daniel's voice hardened with determination. We'll paint an entire ship in the time it takes their crews to do a single section. We'll create a productivity gap so enormous that denying it would be criminal negligence. And if they still say no... Daniel thought about the merchant sailors dying in the North Atlantic, their ships torn apart by torpedoes, about the Liberty ships stacked up in production bottlenecks, waiting for paint to dry while U-boats prowled, about all the hours, the precious, irreplaceable hours, bleeding away while men moved brushes across steel with the same methods used in the age of wooden sailing ships. Then we'll have tried, Daniel said. And that's more than most people can say. But even as he spoke, he knew trying wasn't enough. The war wouldn't wait for bureaucracy. The Atlantic wouldn't pause for pride. And every day that passed with this technology unused was another day of advantage handed to the enemy. The dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate the choices being made in the shadows of America's shipyards. Joseph packed his equipment with careful reverence, each piece wrapped and secured like artifacts of a future that might never arrive. Daniel sealed his documentation in a waterproof envelope, his hands steady despite the weight of what they'd just proven. Together, they walked toward the shipyard gates, past the sleeping cranes and silent welding stations. The fog was lifting, revealing the Manhattan skyline across the water, a city that didn't know how close it was to losing everything because of bureaucratic stubbornness. I'll start drafting the report tonight, Daniel said. Technical specifications, time studies, cost analysis, something so comprehensive they can't dismiss it as anecdotal. Joseph nodded, but his eyes were distant. You know what the worst part is. It's not that they rejected it, it's that they didn't even try to understand it. They saw something new, and their first instinct was fear. Fear of change, fear of being wrong, fear of admitting that maybe, just maybe, a basement inventor could see something they couldn't. Then we'll make them understand. Daniel's jaw set with determination. One way or another. They parted at the gates, Joseph heading back to Chicago with his revolutionary device. Daniel returning to a job where he'd have to pretend the night's work never happened. Above them, the sky was turning pink with morning light. Below them, in the Atlantic depths, submarines were loading torpedoes. And between those two realities, in the narrow space where innovation fought tradition, the future of the war hung suspended like paint droplets in compressed air, waiting to see whether pride or pragmatism would win. War Production Board, Washington, D.C., June 1942. The marble corridors of the War Production Board building echoed with footsteps and urgent conversations. Daniel Chen walked beside Joseph Binks, both men carrying briefcases stuffed with documentation. Photographs, time studies, cost analyses, testimonials from shipyard workers who'd witnessed the secret tests. They'd been working toward this moment for 2 months. 2 months of midnight experiments, of documenting every test, of building an irrefutable case. Daniel had risked everything, his job, his reputation, his future, to get them here. Now they sat in a waiting room outside the office of Howard Vickery, Vice Admiral and Vice Chairman of the Maritime Commission. If anyone in Washington had the power and the vision to override Brooklyn Navy Yard's rejection, it was Vickery. "Mr. Chen, Mr. Binks, the Admiral will see you now." The office was surprisingly modest. No mahogany, no cigar smoke, just a desk covered in production reports and a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Vickery's eyes were bloodshot, his uniform collar loose. Behind him, a wall chart showed merchant ship losses in red and construction rates in blue. The red line was climbing. The blue wasn't climbing fast enough. "You have 15 minutes, Vickery said without preamble. "I have a conference call with the President at 11:30, and I need to tell him why we're 600 vessels behind projected construction goals. So if you're here to sell me another miracle solution that doesn't work, save us both the time." Daniel placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it. "Admiral, what if I told you we could reduce ship painting time by 70% without compromising quality? I'd say you're the 15th person this month to promise me impossible productivity gains." Vickery's tone was flat, exhausted. "And the other 14 were all lying or delusional." "Then let me be the first to prove it with mathematics." Daniel spread photographs across the desk, before and after shots of the test section, close-up showing paint thickness measurements, time-stamped documentation of the entire process. Vickery leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. His fingers traced over the photographs, stopping on the paint thickness readings. "These measurements are accurate?" "Standard brush method takes approximately 4 hours for the same area." "That's not 70% faster. That's..." Vickery grabbed a pencil and began calculating. "That's over 900% faster." "Yes, sir." Daniel felt his heart racing. Vickery was listening. Actually listening. "Across an entire destroyer escort, we estimate total painting time could drop from 2,000 man-hours to under 300. "Show me the device." Joseph opened his wooden crate with shaking hands. The spray gun gleamed under the office lights. Aluminum and brass and possibility. Vickery picked it up, examining the mechanism with the careful attention of someone who understood engineering. Compressed air atomization, similar to automotive paint sprayers. "Modified for marine applications, sir," Joseph said, his voice steadier now. "Thicker paint, higher viscosity, corrosive environment. I've tested it with every Navy specification coating. It works. If it works, why hasn't Brooklyn Navy Yard implemented it?" Vickery's question was sharp, cutting through the promise to the problem beneath. Daniel and Joseph exchanged glances. This was the moment of truth. "Because Admiral Harrington rejected it without testing," Daniel said carefully. "He called it ridiculous, said the Navy doesn't need gadgets." The silence that followed was dangerous. Vickery set down the spray gun with controlled precision. "Admiral Harrington rejected a technology that could save 1,700 man-hours per vessel during a war where we're hemorrhaging shipping faster than we can replace it." "Yes, sir." "On what grounds?" "Tradition, primarily, and a belief that brush painting is inherently superior because it's what the Navy has always done." Vickery stood abruptly and walked to his wall chart. His finger traced the red line of merchant ship losses. "Do you know what these numbers represent? Each one is a ship. Each ship carried 30 to 40 crew members. Each crew member had a family. Last month alone, we lost 87 merchant vessels in the Atlantic. That's over 3,000 men." He turned back to them and his eyes were burning. "And you're telling me we could be building replacement ships faster, getting them to sea faster, potentially saving some of those lives, but we're not. Because one admiral thinks spray guns are beneath the dignity of the United States Navy." "That's correct, sir," Daniel said quietly. Vickery picked up his phone. "Get me Admiral King at Naval Operations. Immediately." He covered the mouthpiece. "How many man-hours did you say? Across the entire war effort?" "Conservatively, 50 million hours, sir. That's assuming current production projections and standard painting procedures." 50 million hours. Vickery repeated it like a curse. "That's the equivalent of 6,000 men working full-time for a year. We could build entire fleets with those hours." The phone crackled. "Admiral King's office on the line, sir." "Ernest? Howard Vickery, I need you to override a rejection from Brooklyn Navy Yard." "No, I'm serious. I have 2 men in my office with a technology that could revolutionize our entire shipbuilding program, and it's been sitting unused for 4 months because Harrington thinks it's ridiculous." A pause. "Yes, I'm aware of chain of command. I'm also aware that we're losing this war in the Atlantic, and I don't particularly care whose pride gets damaged if it means getting ships to sea faster." Daniel barely breathed. This was happening. After months of rejection and midnight tests and desperate hope, this was actually happening. Vickery hung up. "You'll have a formal review board meeting tomorrow at Brooklyn Navy Yard. Admiral King will chair it personally. Bring your device, bring your documentation, and be prepared to demonstrate on an actual vessel. If it works as well as you claim, we'll implement it across every shipyard in America within the month." "And if Harrington objects," Joseph asked, "then Harrington can explain to the President why he chose his ego over American lives." Vickery's voice was ice and iron. "Gentlemen, wars aren't won by tradition. They're won by whoever adapts fastest, and right now we're adapting too slowly." He walked them to the door, then paused. "One more question. Why did you keep pushing this? You could have accepted the rejection and moved on. Why risk your careers?" Daniel thought about the destroyer section drying in the fog, about the merchant sailors waiting for rescue that would come too late, about all the hours bleeding away while men moved brushes with methods from another century. "Because someone had to, sir," Daniel said simply. "And if not us, then who?" Vickery nodded slowly. "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, you're going to change the war." Brooklyn Navy Yard, June 18th, 1942, 0900 hours. The demonstration was scheduled for 9 o'clock, but by 8:30 the dock was crowded. Word had spread through the shipyard like wildfire. Admiral King himself was coming, and someone was about to get either promoted or court-martialed. Admiral Harrington stood near the test vessel, his face carved from stone. Beside him, Captain Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Lieutenant Commander Webb, who'd risked speaking up in the original meeting, stood slightly apart, his expression carefully neutral. At exactly 0900, Admiral Ernest King arrived. He was a tall man, with a face that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile sometime around 1918. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, ruthless, impatient with incompetence in any form. "Gentlemen," he said without preamble, "Mr. Binks, you have 1 hour to convince me that the Navy has been painting ships incorrectly for 200 years. I suggest you make it compelling." Joseph set up his equipment with steady hands. The months of rejection had burned away his nervousness, leaving only quiet determination. Daniel stood beside him, stopwatch ready, documentation prepared. "Admiral, we've marked 2 identical sections of hull," Joseph explained. "Section A will be painted by standard brush method with a 4-man crew. Section B, I'll paint alone with the spray gun. Same paint, same coating specifications, same 2-coat application." "Proceed." The brush crew started first. They were good. Experienced painters who'd worked hundreds of ships. Their movements were practiced, efficient. But efficiency couldn't overcome physics. Each brushstroke took time. Each dip in the paint bucket took time. Coverage was slow, methodical, inevitable. Joseph waited until they'd established their rhythm, then moved to Section B. He connected the compressor, tested the pressure, filled the paint jar. The familiar hiss was like an old friend greeting him. Then he pulled the trigger, and the world changed. Paint flowed like controlled mist, covering steel in smooth, perfect coats. Joseph moved with the grace of someone who'd spent months perfecting his technique. Distance exact, angle precise, each pass overlapping the last with mathematical perfection. The sound was soft, almost meditative compared to the scrape and slap of brushes. Admiral King checked his watch, checked it again. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. 15 minutes after starting, Joseph completed the first coat on Section B. The brush crew was perhaps 30% done with Section A. 28 minutes after starting, Joseph completed both coats. The brush crew was halfway through their first coat. Joseph set down the spray gun and stepped back. Section B gleamed perfect and smooth in the morning sun. "Complete, sir." King walked to the painted surface, running his hand across it. He pulled out a paint thickness gauge. He'd brought his own, Daniel noticed, and began taking measurements. Every reading was within specification. Several exceeded it. "How long for the brush crew to finish?" King asked. "Approximately 90 more minutes, sir," Daniel reported. "Total time will be around 2 hours for their section." So Mr. Binks completed in 28 minutes. What takes a skilled crew 2 hours? King turned to Harrington. "And you rejected this because—" Harrington's face was rigid. "Sir, the device is unproven in long-term naval conditions. We don't know how it performs with different weather, different paints, It performs magnificently," King interrupted. "I can see that with my own eyes. What you mean is, you didn't want to admit you were wrong." He turned to Joseph. "Mr. Binks, how quickly can you train workers to use this device?" "A competent painter can learn the basics in a few hours, sir. Mastery takes perhaps a week of practice." "And how many of these spray guns can you manufacture?" Joseph hesitated. "Currently, I have 3 prototypes, but with proper funding and manufacturing support, thousands. The design is simple. Any machine shop can produce them." King nodded slowly, his mind clearly calculating. "Captain Morrison, you're in charge of implementing this technology across Brooklyn Navy Yard. I want every ship touched by spray guns within 60 days. Anyone who objects can explain themselves to me personally." "Yes, sir." Morrison's voice was barely audible. "Admiral Harrington." King's tone could have frozen steel. "You will prepare a full report explaining why this technology sat unused for 4 months. I'll expect it on my desk by Monday." "Sir, I was simply being cautious." "You were being stubborn." King's words fell like hammer blows. "Caution is healthy, pride is deadly, and in this case your pride may have cost us ships we desperately needed." Dismissed. Harrington left without another word, his career crumbling behind him like rust. King turned back to Joseph and Daniel. "Effective immediately, you're both assigned to the Bureau of Ships. Mr. Binks, you'll oversee manufacturing and distribution of these spray guns. Mr. Chen, you'll develop training programs and implementation protocols. Questions?" "Just one, sir," Joseph said quietly. "Why now? Why did it take months and a trip to Washington before anyone listened?" King was silent for a long moment, watching the brush crew still working on their section. Because organizations don't change easily, Mr. Binks. They resist new ideas. They protect old ways. It takes crisis to force evolution. And right now, we're in the biggest crisis in American history." He paused. "But you already knew that. That's why you kept pushing when any reasonable man would have quit." He shook their hands, a rare gesture from a man not known for warmth. "Congratulations, gentlemen. You just won a small piece of this war. Now let's make sure we win the rest of it." Brooklyn Navy Yard, September 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The Atlantic was safe. And Daniel Chen stood on the same dock where 3 years earlier he'd helped Joseph Binks perform an illegal test in the fog. The shipyard was quieter now. No more frantic production schedules. No more midnight shifts. No more desperate race against submarine wolf packs. But the legacy of that foggy night remained visible everywhere. Workers moved across hulls with spray guns, applying paint in minutes instead of hours. What had once seemed ridiculous was now standard procedure. Joseph had gone back to Chicago, his small company now manufacturing industrial spray equipment for peacetime industries. He'd never become rich. The military contracts had been fair but not generous, but he'd saved those 50 million hours, maybe more. The mathematics suggested closer to 75 million hours recovered across the entire war effort. 75 million hours that built more ships, trained more sailors, won more battles. How many lives had been saved? The calculation was impossible. But somewhere in the Atlantic, there were merchant sailors who'd made it home because their rescue vessel had been built faster. Somewhere in the Pacific, there were soldiers who'd received supplies because the transport ships were painted and deployed weeks earlier than they would have been. Lieutenant Commander Webb, now Captain Webb, approached from the administrative building. He'd survived the war, survived the bureaucracy, and emerged as one of the Navy's leading advocates for technological innovation. "Thinking about the old days?" Webb asked. "Thinking about how close we came to losing," Daniel replied. "If Vickery hadn't listened, if King hadn't overridden Harrington, if we'd just accepted the first rejection." "But you didn't accept it, that's what matters." Webb looked out over the shipyard. "You know what the real lesson is? It's not about spray guns or paint or even those 75 million hours. It's about the cost of saying no to innovation, about what happens when pride matters more than truth." Daniel nodded slowly. Harrington wasn't evil. He was just convinced that old ways were best because they were old. That tradition was more important than evidence. "And how many other Harringtons are out there?" Webb mused. "In this war, in the next one, in peacetime industries. How many brilliant ideas get rejected because someone with power thinks they already know everything?" It was a question without an easy answer. The Navy had learned, painfully, expensively, that innovation couldn't be dismissed just because it challenged tradition. But would the lesson last? Or would the next generation of admirals forget and repeat the same mistakes? A young sailor walked past carrying a spray gun, heading toward a vessel being prepped for decommissioning. He moved with casual confidence, completely unaware that the device in his hands had once been called ridiculous. To him, it was just a tool, obvious, essential, normal. That was the real victory, Daniel realized. Not just implementing the technology, but making it so ubiquitous that people forgot there was ever any other way. "I'm heading back to civilian life," Daniel said. "Stanford offered me a position teaching industrial engineering. Figured I'd try to train the next generation to question assumptions." Webb smiled. "Good. God knows we need more people willing to challenge authority when authority is wrong." He extended his hand. "Thanks for being stubborn, Daniel. Thanks for caring more about the truth than your career." They shook hands, and Webb walked back toward the administrative building. Daniel stood alone on the dock, watching workers prepare ships for mothballing. The war was over, but the lessons remained. Somewhere in a Chicago workshop, Joseph Binks was probably designing something new. Somewhere in Washington, bureaucrats were probably rejecting someone's brilliant idea because it seemed ridiculous. And somewhere in the future, another crisis would come, and the question would be the same. Would innovation be embraced or rejected? Would truth win or would pride? Daniel thought about that foggy night 3 years ago, about the terror of getting caught, about the spray gun transforming steel in the darkness, about betting everything on a device the Navy had called a toy. 50 million hours. That was the original estimate, the cost of rejection, but they'd recovered those hours and more. They'd proven that one person with a good idea and one person willing to believe in them could change the course of history. The sun was setting over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The shipyard would be quiet tomorrow, but the spray guns would remain, silent testimony to a truth that transcended war and peace alike. Progress doesn't ask permission. It only asks for someone brave enough to believe in it. Daniel picked up his briefcase and walked toward the gates. Behind him, the painted ships gleamed in the dying light. Ahead of him, a future shaped by the lesson that ridiculous ideas are sometimes the only ones worth fighting for. The war was over, but the battle against stubborn thinking that war would never end. It would be fought in every conference room, every laboratory, every moment when someone with power had to choose between pride and progress. Daniel Chen had won his battle. The question was whether the next generation would win theirs. The gates closed behind him with a metallic clang, and somewhere in the Atlantic depths, in water that had once run red with the blood of rejected innovation, the ocean was finally at peace.